Everybody's doing tonight.
In Arizona, what's a 4 o'clock game?
2015. The 8th one, I see a few of you have been here at every single one of them. I don't think some of you have left the building in that time. But really appreciate everybody making it out yet again. This is definitely our largest. Still, you in back. We do have seats up front. Come on forward. It is. I don't fight or attack people too often, despite the room
Anymore.
So. Really appreciate you all being out here. Usually I'll make a few announcements at this time. I will thank our big sponsors, for instance, Tripwire, Hi-Res Studios, Avient, and talk about the changes in the schedule. Thankfully, because we've got the app for that, I don't have to do that as much this year. We've had a few minor changes. There are addendums out there. So we do appreciate you all checking those out. And so far, been a great weekend so far, and the weekend's just started. We had an excellent college fair yesterday. Sorry for those of you who are too old to attend the college fair anymore. I see there's some folks who transitioned from college fair to the main conference now. And there's a great Games for Health Day, great investment conference starting it up. And I think really the only thing that can top what we've done so far is the keynote from Zoe Quinn. Those of us who work in the game industry know how much work every single game is. It doesn't matter if you're doing mobile, it doesn't matter if you're doing strategy games, it doesn't matter if you're doing some of the AAA titles like Smite and Killing Floor 2 and so on. It doesn't matter if you're doing a little game about vampires you only think 1,000 people will ever play. You know how much blood, sweat, and tears goes into every single game you do. That's why it's especially impressive when people put out games on titles on areas we don't really expect. One of the beautiful things about the Games for Health Jam today was having 15 games here, all very different, about HIV. It's really interesting when people select generally untapped areas to use games to explore, expand upon, and make a lot more interesting. And frankly, that's what I think Depression Quest did. It touched on something I never would have made a game about, jokes about Malkavians and vampires aside. It's not something I would have ever done, and it's very interesting to see these mechanics applied to it. One of the things we have done with pretty much all my games, whether you're making an economic engine, whether you're making a political engine, is you are adapting things from real life to put into the games. But I always take mine in a more fictional area. That's what most of us in games do. It's very interesting when someone tries to, and successfully does, apply these principles, these real-life engines to game engines. And that's why I'm looking forward to this presentation. This is a major part of every developer's job, every designer's job, and frankly, if you're a programmer, you know it ends up being your job because the designer always does a slap-ass job of coming up with these systems. So you're the ones who end up having to translate these into something that will actually work in the game. So this is actually one of my favorite areas of game design, translating things like economics, like politics, everything about the real world into games and making it not just work right, but engage an audience and make people think. And I think that's what Zoe Quinn has done very well. So without further ado, Zoe Quinn.
It's going to be difficult to follow that up. I'm Zoe Quinn. I'm an independent game developer, and I guess I'm going to start out with telling you a little bit about who I am, in case you aren't familiar with me. I've been a game developer for about 3 years now, almost. I've made probably upwards of 30 some odd games, releasing a lot of them as very small comedy games, like Waiting for Godot, which is pretty much just a loading screen, as well as Jeff Goldblum's Staring Contest, which is exactly what it sounds like. But I'm probably best known for my game Depression Quest, as he mentioned, which is the first Twine game to get on Steam. Just got it on just last month, which is kind of cool. I'm also a grassroots game educator. I co-founded a nonprofit called Dave's Making Games, and since then I've also done work in the LGBT community that focuses largely on getting a lot of people who are traditionally discouraged from making games involved, including people with no tech experience and no background at all. So I want to preface this talk with talking a little bit about my personal design philosophy and a lot of the things that I see new designers make that are kind of a mistake. So I like to call this just because design philosophy. A lot of times when I'm teaching somebody to make their first game and they have some experience with games, they usually start out with an I'm going to make a platformer, or I'm going to make a side-scrolling beat-em-up, something like that. And I think that that's kind of a faulty place to start. Any place that gets you started and gets you making things is always, no matter what, that's fantastic, because the most important part is making things. But a lot of the time it seems to come from a reductive angle, from a just because design philosophy, where you've said that you want to put something in there just because it's cool, and you want to make a game that looks a lot like a lot of other games do. This can be kind of unfortunately limiting, because a lot of these choices that we make kind of narrow the sort of games that get made, and it's sort of a bad habit, especially for starting designers, to look at a game like Angry Birds, for instance, and say, I want to make something that's like that, but slightly different, because they don't walk through the process that of making those decisions themselves and making them with purpose in mind. So a lot of the time it comes with a lot of baggage. So this also comes with a notion pre-packaged with it of what games are supposed to be, which is just inherently limiting to any artist, because if you start out from a place where you're just coming from it at a purely derivative angle instead of trying to think about what you're communicating, you're not analyzing those choices independently each time you make it. And you fall into the trap of doing these things just because, rather than because it's a good design decision or it's purposeful to the game that you're making. It's sort of similar to following guitar tabs versus learning music theory. It doesn't hurt to start there if it gets you making things, but you're going to fundamentally be working on a lot of stuff that you don't understand for its parts. So not challenging the how and why of your choices can lead to poor execution on those choices as well, because you don't know what the strengths are, you don't know what the weaknesses are, you just know I'm making this decision just because. So it can kind of get you into some bad decisions you might not have made otherwise and sort of trap you. It's a lot similar to HDR in photography, which started out as tone mapping, which can really sort of bring out color and beauty in your photos, and sort of caught on and became a thing that people did versus a thing that people use knowingly. And as such, the trend in HDR has sort of made everybody's photos look like this. So it's sort of like creating a slider for something and just janking it to the right instead of having a fundamental, deep understanding of what you're doing and why. So I would argue that best practices of game design, despite hating the word synergy, reinforce the core mission statement of your game. You want to figure out what your game is about and why. You want to then structure every system in this game to reinforce that. And that's not just game mechanics either. That's also what kind of art style you use. It's also what kind of music you use. It's also the platform, the marketing, everything. So everything in a game should have a reason for being there that benefits the game, not just because the designer wants it there. And I know it can be very difficult to kill your babies and be like, you know what, this isn't actually contributing anything, but it's something I really like though, so I just kind of want to jam it in there awkwardly even though it doesn't. Don't do that. And you can tell when some games do this because you just don't know what that thing is doing there. You can end up with this messy pile of systems that doesn't really work together so much. The starting point that I prefer to come from is one of figuring out the core statement and point and extrapolating everything in the game from this. And there are a lot of games I think do this quite well, one of them being Gone Home. Gone Home's core conceit is that it's a coming-of-age tale, and since this is something that starts with the narrative as the starting point for the design and that everything wraps into, the fact that you're going through a house, going through these artifacts of a teenager to sort of figure out what they're about, what the story is, that ties into it because it's nostalgic as heck to be going through these old things, these mixtapes, these notes, these diaries and drawings to reinforce this whole coming-of-age feeling and narrative, and in that way it's incredibly cohesive. Similarly, a game that has nothing to do with story and everything to do with shooting things, Vlambeer does this amazing thing where they, instead of structuring everything on a narrative or structuring anything on an art style, they structure everything on a design ethos of exploring what they thought was cool about arcade games. And to that effect, they absolutely nail it like every time. They're known for making a lot of good stuff. Or it could just be exploring a core mechanic like Goat Simulator. Goat Simulator's whole point is that it's completely asinine and ridiculous. It focuses on these wonky physics, and as such, everything in the game reinforces that because you're playing as a goat for some reason, just because that's ridiculous. A lot of the things you can do in the game are utterly ridiculous. It just, the way the game talks to you, like saying, you get a really big-ass score, like that's completely ridiculous. So at every level, it reinforces this notion of just, you know, why not? So if we're not starting from this point of, let's make a platformer because I like platformers, we can start from a number of different places. Like, honestly, there's so many different approaches to games. There's so many different game designers doing different things, but one that I personally have become really interested in and making sure that all of my stuff works together quite well to do interesting things you might not have expected otherwise is real life. I really like realism in games. I think a lot of interesting work is coming out of that. There's some really great examples currently of this being done to quite decent effect. That Dragon Cancer being one of them, which is a game where you are a father dealing with the fact that your son has cancer, and at one point all you can do in the game is just pray after your kid's flatlined. It's very intense, it's very moving, and it's not traditionally a thing that you would see, and it's being made by a designer who's basically doing an autobiographical story with that. Another really good example is Papers, Please, which is a game where you play as a border guard that has to choose whether or not to let certain people into your country. Another one is Dysphoria, which is a game made by Anna Anthropy. It's an exploration of the different systems and things that you have to navigate when you're transitioning gender. And my game Depression Quest was also meant to be sort of a game that takes a lot from realism. So it just really illustrates that systems are everywhere. Everything in life, just about, is some kind of system at some level. And as game designers, systems are our bread and butter. Whether it's, you know, press button X this hard, get that effect on thing Y. And really what it comes down to is it's anything that's a predictable input-output flow is a system. If you know that when you do X, you get Y result. If you know that you do X in a particular, slightly modified fashion, Y will be accordingly modified one way or the other. It's essentially algebra, which lets us then look at anything in life and sort of break it down into these big chunks of systems. For example, let's say we have a pet. We can look at caring for this pet as sort of a system. Let's say you know that you need to give the pet food, and that makes it happy and healthy. So then that's like, we're starting to sort of put together this equation of how things work. If you know that if you give your pet no food, they'll probably die. You know, if you give the pet too much food, they will also probably die. And you know that, so if you shoot to make sure that this variable is in a certain range to try and get this desired outcome, that's a system. That's exactly a system, and that's easily translatable into a game mechanic. And it's rewarding in that the player would assumingly want to keep the pet happy and healthy unless there's something massively wrong with you. And it's pretty simple. So, but wait, let's sort of zoom out a little bit. Health can be impacted by a number of things. Say you want to add another variable where you exercise your pet a certain amount, and that impacts how the food intake affects this pet's health, and that's another variable in this equation. Say you want to include happiness in this too, to make sure, like, as a variable in terms of the overall general well-being of your pet. That's another thing you can add in. But wait, what happens when the pet gets sick? Do you take care of it properly? That's another thing that we can throw into this equation, and then, oh crap, we made Tamagotchi. So even just things like that, things that are just in everyday life, that are just around us, can be broken down into these systems, however simple or complex you want to get about it. So we can apply this process to just about anything to varying degrees of complexity. This method sort of takes a look at the way things are in the world and breaks it down into smaller parts, focusing on that particular system and using that system as a core game mechanic, which you can then structure everything else around it. This is sort of this is the method that I took to creating Depression Quest. Depression Quest is about living with a depression like an everyday person, and the inspiration for it came when we were talking and thinking about how depression very much is a system. You know, you live by different rules than other people do. you can't do certain things impact you differently, and it's very much a predictable input-output system. Turning those rules into the central mechanic of choice in Depression Quest, which, as you can see, some of the options are crossed off here, that get generated and populated based on how your current depression levels are, that's like a simple game mechanic just in and of itself. And Depression Quest is very much about this, and very much about showing how, as your depression gets lower, more choices get taken away. It's essentially a game about taking away choice and agency, because that's essentially what depression itself does. We also did things like adding mitigating factors into it, like social support, therapy, and other coping mechanisms that can impact your motivation levels and lead to multiple outcomes, including therapy, medication, talking with people. I also coded the mechanism for taking medication to try and systemically model the way that taking medication can affect a depressed person in real life. Taking medication doesn't simply make it so that when a choice goes badly, or when something goes badly, even when it isn't your choice, it doesn't make it null. You still take a hit, but it's lessened. And that's very much how medication works on people with depression that respond to it. So in this way, this approach becomes a powerful tool for making a piece of media, not necessarily focusing on games or simulation, or if whoever wants to beat the dead horse of what is a game argument, but you make a powerful piece of media that you can then build up from and stay on point and stay focused on communicating this lived experience to other people. And it's one of the most powerful tools, I think, that we have for empathy in any medium. You're literally creating a digital space in which people can live by the rules that other people experience. This, I believe, is one of the reasons that we're seeing so many games from minority voices that take this sort of realist attitude, instead of just seeing a dozen people of color only making shooters. We see a lot of things that are coming out of minority voices in games that say, hey, I haven't seen myself represented in any of this. I do not appear in this. Here's my experience. Step into my shoes for a little while. And as previously stated, that Dragon Cancer is a minority viewpoint, that it's somebody who's dealing with a very debilitating illness. Papers, Please deals with people who have gone through immigration. Dysphoria deals with the experiences of trans people. And Depression Quest deals with the experience of living with mental illness. However, I'm also, this is, I think, one of the biggest strengths that games as a medium has. Also, I'm very appreciative for other games. Not every game has to be like this. For instance, I will never stop playing Dynasty Warriors, no matter how many they make and how many times they reuse the same story. So I'm not trying to advocate all games should be like this. All games should simply be purely an emotional experience, purely an empathy game, if you want to call them that, but it's actually just a different way of doing things that I think we're starting to see more and more of, and I think there's certain ways to do this properly and not. So if you're into that sort of thing, that's a way to do it. The thing is, though, this can be really tricky when expressing real-life experiences through systems, because we have to be incredibly mindful of what we do and don't say. Because it's not like if you have, the reality in games and a lot of the conventions of gaming have been founded on 20 years of not making a ton of sense. In that, like, say, a great way to illustrate this is find somebody who's never played a video game before and sit them down in front of Mario. I personally like to do this sometimes. A lot of them will jump down that first pit because they're like, oh, what's down there? They don't have any reason to think that pit equals death. And I know if you play a lot of games, you have this moment in a game before you touch water. Exactly. You know what I'm talking about. You might die or it might be fine. And it's water. Like, that makes no sense. It's fine. It works as a gaming convention. It absolutely works for level design. But just on a realistic level, that makes zero sense. So when you're making a game that relies on realism, it's very difficult to rely on these things that if you juxtapose next to something that everybody does, having something like having red exploding barrels everywhere when you're trying to talk about cancer doesn't make any sense. You can't quite do that. And I think it's generally discouraged to trash out of the garbage as well. I wouldn't really think that that would be a beneficial health thing, but in a lot of video game conventions, it's just a thing we do, which is another reason why we have to question every design decision we make along the way, instead of just doing things because that's how they're done in games. So we have to really question and challenge our design choices because we can also inadvertently say something really heinous about a serious subject. Like, for example, if the way Depression Quest handles medication was an incredibly difficult decision to make. Because if you mess that up, you can say some really awful things. For example, we had to make sure that medication wasn't the only option to get the better endings where you were managing your depression better than you could. Because if we had just made it so, oh, you take a pill, everything's fine, then now what our systems are saying is that, oh, medication is the answer for everybody, and that's patently false. Beyond that, it's also false. It's a false representation of the development team. I don't think there's anybody on there that has, it's myself, another writer, and our musician. We all have depression, and none of it's just magically gone away with a pill. Likewise, if we didn't offer multiple ways to mitigate it, we'd be saying systemically, you take medication or you're miserable, end of story. So having the option be an option was very important, and making sure that we didn't penalize the player, because then our systems are saying something that we aren't meaning to say that ends up being heinous. So we need to really police that if we're making games about realism and if we're making games to make a point. Beyond that, it also dishonestly would reflect how medication works, which, considering that part of Depression Quest's goal was to push against the stigma of people living with this illness, it would be shooting ourselves in the foot. It would be continuing to mystify a scenario, because there's plenty of preconceptions about depression. One of them can be that, oh, you just take medication, you're fine, but really it's more you take medication and that helps you work on things that will later lead to things being better. Similarly, there's no, hey, you're cured ending in Depression Quest, when a lot of games have a good or bad fail state. It's very nebulous. It's a, you managed this well, or you had a bad year. In addition, one of the biggest questions was, do we add suicide? Because suicide in and of itself is this tremendous subject to tackle, and it's one that not only is it difficult for the development team to go down that rabbit hole, it's also becomes the game that you can get the main character to kill themselves. And worse still, you have to consider that when you make a video game, you're essentially having a back and forth with a player you don't know and you can't fully predict. So we would have, if we allowed suicide, then probably had a subsection of players who were trying to get the character to kill themselves. We already did, despite not having that option. And that can become a little bit grisly, and it's like, do you really want this thing that's supposed to be about reaching out and about illustrating this to end up being, the kill yourself simulator? It's not great. So you have to take into account not only what your systems are saying, but what your systems are giving the potential for the players to say. There's a lot of common pitfalls that games can have that pull from real life. And one of them is that not everything is necessarily suited for this approach. For example, dating simulators. Dating simulators, trying to boil down into a singular system is almost impossible. People are way too complex for that. And unless you go completely off the reality deep end and do something like How to Fool a Boyfriend, which is a pigeon dating simulator, that's exactly what it looks like, and it's awesome. You're now dealing with something where your systems can end up trying to distill something into kindness in, booty out. And that's not great. That's not really how anything works. And if you're trying to go for realism, what you've done is completely the opposite. Beyond that, say you wanted to sit down and be like, no, I'm going to model romance accurately. I'm going to make a dating simulator that takes all of these things into account. Then you probably have a mess of a game. And I say this after 2 years of working on one that was trying to do that. So the more complex the system is, the harder it becomes to communicate to the player. You end up with this massive, jumbled bunch of things where it can be just, honestly, ironically like real life in the dating simulator example, it can be impossible to figure out exactly what's going on. So it's sort of a mess, and there's some things that you might not want to do realistically, or if you want to try and do realistically, you should focus in on one single aspect of. Otherwise, it just turns into an imperceivable mess. So the more complex the system is, the harder it becomes to communicate to the player in a transparent way so that they understand what's going on. The feedback loops become more and more incredulous, and people will just be confused. And since I personally believe that art is a large part of communication, if whoever's on the other end of it isn't receiving what you're meaning to transmit, then you've kind of failed on that front, even if you make a fun game. But again, define what your goals are early, structure everything around that. So if your point is to be fun, just go for that. If the point is to do a realistic game that pulls on system examples from life, you gotta be a little bit transparent. So some subjects are also highly individualistic. And it's important to state that you're not trying to speak for an entire demographic if you're going with something that's largely a personal experience. Like with Depression Quest, using as an example again, it's impossible, I think, to make a definitive artwork that applies to every single person living with depression. I think that's quite literally impossible. You know, everybody has so many different backgrounds. There's many people, like even within the development team, medication worked for my colleague, it did not work for me. Therapy never worked for me. I couldn't afford it for most of my life. I didn't have the support network the main character had. Plenty of people with depression don't have the significant other, but we wanted to be able to examine how the illness can impact those things, so we ended up making a design decision to go with it. And it's very much meant to be sort of a 101. I have no idea how depression works. I think it's just a bad mood that I tell people to bootstraps out of thing. It's supposed to push against that sort of level of knowledge. So, and the game very clearly states this up front. So you need to decide early on if you're going for a more general subject matter covering thing, or if you're going to relate to personal experience. And that needs to also be reflected in your systems. It needs to be reflected in how you talk about the game, in like outside of the game itself too. You can't say, oh, we made a game that default shows everybody what depression is like, or oh, we made the experience on depression. It's like, no, we reached out and said, hey, this is our experience. This is how it feels to us. How does it feel to you? It's like meant to start a conversation. So another thing to worry about with this too is that people might take what you make, if it's something that's sort of representational of a demographic or of a larger system that affects a lot of people, and take it as a de facto lesson, which can be really problematic, especially when it comes to dating simulators. Because you can see some people take this as a lesson to learn, and take it as the only lesson to learn, and take it with no nuance, and apply it widely, which is why you can sometimes see things like the game with pickup artists that treat actual people like dating simulators, where you get kindness in or attention in and booty out. Because as much as everything is systems, people are a lot of systems, so much so that we haven't been able to accurately model them in things like dating simulators. So we need to accept that sort of responsibility that as we go forward designing, that people might be taking what we say as the definitive thing to say, regardless of our intent, and make decisions with that in mind. Other people who you will interact with if you're making a game about real life probably have very strong opinions on the matter. And no one can tell you that your fictional Wizards Guild doesn't work quite the right way, and actually that mage would be doing something completely different. Like, you'll get that sometimes. Like if you've done a bad job of your narrative, or you've fallen into a plot hole or something like that, that can happen, but it's a bit different when you're doing something that is actually modeled, that exists in the real world, and have this jarring break in reality. For example, say you do something about law enforcement, like you want to talk about that structure. If you do something that can be highly politicized, or that people's experiences are very, very personal and very important to them, you have to be very aware that people are probably going to have very strong opinions about it one way or the other, and make design choices that account for that. One of the best ways you can do that is just research everything, like everything. Don't just go based on one factor, don't just go based on your own experience, unless you're purely making a game just about your own experience. Talk to everyone you can with first-hand knowledge, read everything that you can. We have Wikipedia, we have all kinds of places that are probably more than happy to talk with you, as well as other people's writing and games and other media on the subject. Even with Depression Quest, even though we were going quite personal, we still talked to a bunch of therapists, we talked to a bunch of other depression sufferers, we saw mega threads, we looked for mega threads that would be just people with depression talking about their experiences to see what closely matched ours and what might be a little bit too much to us. So we tried to strike that target of both personal and trying to generalize so it wasn't completely personal. And even if you do completely personal games, highly recommend research anyway. You have nothing to lose by researching your subject matter. Another thing is, since everything is kind of a system, you can get in systems within systems within systems within systems, and this is basically scope creep nightmare hell land. So no matter what you do, it seems like you can always add more stuff in. There's almost always something more at play. And to quote Lauryn Hill, everything is everything. So you have to decide what you want to do there and where you want to cut it off. You just hone in on what you're trying to do, go back to that thesis statement. Early on in a project, I very much like to have a one-sentence thesis statement. I know that the guys who designed Shadow of the Colossus had an image instead of a sentence that was just this big colossus towering over a little guy. And anytime they had to make a design decision, they just referred back to that poster. Doing something like that has never steered me wrong in any design things. So don't try to fit in everything if it's not within scope, whether or not you're talking about development scope and budget, or even just scope of what you're trying to do. Like, for example, Depression Quest does not deal with trying to find a good therapist. It does not deal with trying to find the right diagnosis. It does not deal with the socioeconomic struggles behind being somebody who can afford therapy in the first place. It does not touch difference between the different approaches that men and women have to therapy and who is more likely to seek help. It does not approach any of that. It doesn't go with comorbidity. It doesn't go with any of that, or even just suicide, because that's way too much. And if you try to fit everything in, you're going to dissolve your point of it. You're going to lose focus. The player's not going to have as strong of a message at the end if you have all of this extra stuff. And I'm very much a firm believer in the design and philosophy that some things aren't finished when there's nothing left to add, things are finished when there's nothing left to take away. And beyond that, it's kind of nice to just throw stuff out of your game. Especially when you're early on and you haven't done anything yet, or you're trying to make something fit and it doesn't quite fit, listen to your game. Just listen to it, get rid of stuff, it's less work that you have to do, you're more likely to ship things, and your game will be more on point and coherent. When you make a serious game, or a game about something that is based in reality, people are going to want to talk to you about it. And this is one thing that I absolutely did not anticipate myself when I went out to make Depression Quest. I thought I was just putting this thing out to the world. I thought I was externalizing this stuff in my brain that I needed to get out, or so I didn't do something stupid. And what I had put this thing out to the world, and the thing I did not anticipate was getting it back tenfold. When you tell something that's personal, when you tell something that's from experience or from the real world, people are going to want to talk to you about it. They're going to want to share their experiences. Games fundamentally are back and forth between the game designer and a third party. And as such, a lot of people want to continue the conversation afterwards. So if you make a game about a personal subject, you sort of end up in the space where you're not just providing tech support, but you're providing emotional support as well. And that's something to try and be ready if it's something that's personal, or if it's something you have strong feelings about. It's a sort of, it comes with a certain amount of responsibility, I feel. I can't tell anybody else how to be, but I know that personally when somebody sends, I get a fan mail thing that starts off with, I've never told anybody this, but I have an obligation there. I can't just let it go to nothing. And similarly, I've gotten suicide notes from players before. So I've had to go out and try and find tech support for the social media things that I've received through that to try and do something about it. So if you're going to want to make a serious game, just be aware that that's a thing you should emotionally prepare for, because I was not. The first couple postmortems and talks I gave on it, people would come up to me afterwards, and I would basically need to go have a hyperventilating panic freak out in the bathroom afterwards. So maybe just, be aware of it, be prepared, don't be surprised. It's good to, I honestly thought 5 people would play the game, 4 people would think I was dumb, 1 person would be like, yeah, okay. So it's best to prepare for success, even if you're not planning on it. To be, ready and aware of what might happen if things go right, not just if things happen wrong. So, yeah, sorry, I've got 5 minutes on that account order. So this approach also doesn't have to be for purely serious topics either. I'm currently working on another game that I'm taking this exact approach to, called Camp's Not Dead, which is an homage to crappy B cinema. And say that's our one sentence design love. We're pulling from something in real life. We're looking at camp as a system in and of itself. So what does that translate to in a game? First off, obviously it's going to be an FMV game, no question. Secondly, so then it's what do you do in it? What is the mechanic? What is the system here? How do we communicate this love of awful things. So what we're doing is presenting the player more or less three choices. The normal good choice, the incorrect choice, and then the so bad it's good choice. And as you choose the third choice enough, a camp meter appears. And then the game starts to look lower budget around you. Like, we want to have a robot character that starts out looking like a robot, and then the camp meter fills up, and then it's a dude in a bunch of cardboard boxes making beep boop noises, and as it fills up, it's a dude in a shirt that just says robot on it, and as it fills up, a dude in a shirt that says robot on it, but this time it's Comic Sans. So, even with something completely ridiculous, you can still pull from real-life systems, you can still find ways to make the mechanics reinforce whatever you're trying to say with it and why you're trying to do it. So, once we have this notion of what we want to do, once we have our one sentence, once we know what we're making, we can then wrap, it's so much easier to then wrap all of the other elements of the game into this. And it's a wasted opportunity when you're working with something like a game that pulls from so many different disciplines, whether it's art, sound, design, writing, if it pulls from so many of these things, to not make all of them prop up this single sentence and this coherent point, you're completely missing out on a huge opportunity to take full advantage of the medium, and you end up making weaker media. And there's some things that should just maybe not be a game and be something else if you can't find a way to incorporate all these things. Otherwise, then you're falling into the just because design philosophy in a whole new way, where it's a game just because you want it to be a game, not because you have anything to say with mechanics, not because you have anything to do with that, and that works fine for some people. I personally think it's a weak approach to design, especially for games, but it really misses out on a huge opportunity to make all these things work together. So again, using Depression Quest as an example, so then you have to think about things like art choices. For Depression Quest, we went with the choice of interactive fiction just for the visuals and the world and the way that people interact with it. Not because I can't code something that is more involved with that, because I can and I have and I will again, if nobody stops me, which they probably should considering the things I make. So we wanted to not make this 3D world or 2D world where you walk up to something and press A to receive words. We didn't want to do that. Since it's very much about the internal focuses and the everyday struggle, it made more sense to go with interactive fiction and go with a lot of words and focus on the mental and internal processes of the depression sufferer. Similarly, for the images in the game, we went with photos because it's semi-autobiographical and it very much shoots for this realism angle. And the photos then have a layer of static that is generated based on your current levels of depression applied to it to sort of touch on it on a more emotional level of talking about the sort of the dissonance that happens in your head, the lethargy and the fogginess and out-of-focusedness that comes with having depression. Similarly for Camp's Not Dead, going in a completely different direction and making it look like it basically was being played on a VHS game that fell off the back of a truck. Sound choices too, so we move on to audio. Depression Quest has 3 audio tracks playing at all time. The down-tempo piano orchestral track that's always playing is meant to sort of set the sort of moodiness and emotional feel that we're going for the game. It also has a track that is based on kind of encounter that you're having, whether you're at work or at a cafe and you hear some sort of chatter in the background, to sort of provide some sort of ambient disconnect feeling between you and your surroundings. And it also has this staticky glitch track that ties into the depression levels that you're currently dealing with that matches the visuals. So all 3 of these things are working together at once. Similarly for Camp's Not Dead, we're pretty much just going with guitars. So it's not simply just how the game itself is designed, but you also have to consider how the game itself is delivered to your players. So what we chose was to go with, since the stated purpose was to communicate and build awareness of depression, we then made it so it was web-based, so it runs on pretty much everything, including, phones. It's automatically mobile, down to the browser that you can launch in-game from the Seeker world. It runs on that too. You can Gameception. So it also makes it very easy for people who don't want to download things, because people sometimes just don't feel like downloading, especially if they've never heard of you and they don't know what this is. So by removing that barrier, it becomes easier to reach a lot more people. Beyond that, you don't have to worry about things like what platform are they using? Are they using Mac, Linux, or PC? No porting, just done. In addition to that, it's then also wondering about things down to the control schemes. How do you interact with this game? If I've given twin stick games to plenty of people who have never played games before, and they do that thing where you're just going in a circle pointing at the ground, because they don't have those practiced, lived experiences of playing with dual stick controllers. I know the first time I used one, I'm like, so taking that into account, all you have to do is be able to click on an option. And through this, it became very easy to reach a lot of people who don't traditionally play games. I get plenty of messages from people that have nothing to do with games, that have come across the game from one way or the other, and we're able to actually be like, oh, okay, I can actually interact with that. I speak this language. And the nice thing, the nice little side bonus from that, if you're being sneaky about it, is that it's also kind of like a gateway drug. You're like, oh, well, you like this game, maybe you should play this other game. And then it brings in new blood to the entire industry and the entire medium, and we have nothing to lose from that. So, in making it so accessible, it reinforced this ethos of trying to make sure as many people as possible could play it and build awareness, and so it very much was about awareness. Camp's Not Dead, we are looking into the viability of making a 3DO port. Because, goddamn, I really want that. So it doesn't really, you don't really just stop at the end of the game's creation either. You continue extending this sort of attitude of what is right for the game, how do I best represent this, past that. So for Depression Quest, part of it comes into marketing. If we put it behind a paywall, not many people can play it, especially from how hard do you think it is to market, hey, play this game with a lot of words in it by some lady about mental illness. Like, nobody wants to buy that game. So making it pay what you want, it allows the player to engage with it even when they're skeptical. It's especially useful for anything that is experimental, anything that is a hard sell, anything that's breaking new ground. And if you're just starting out, it's really useful because you can then have people who played your games, are aware of it, and be able to be like, oh, hi, I'm making this new project. You've played my stuff before. You're hopefully a fan of it. And if so, maybe support this work that is commercial, purely commercial. In addition, pay what you want is also nice because if people really do love the work that you do, they can actually support you past what you might expect. Like if we put it up for 99 cents, that would be way lower than the average price of people who do pay. So it makes market sense in addition to being the right thing to do. And similarly, one of the design decisions we made on that front was to give a portion of the proceeds to charity, or specifically charities that fought back against the stigma of mental illness. But before it was IFRED, now we go with the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. So your decisions don't just have to end there. Similarly, when you show the game, like if you're lucky enough to get into a festival, or if you are paying for booth space, it's like how do you show this game? So what we did, because nobody wants, we were sandwiched between dubstep and dubstep, which is kind of not great for a game that's very serious and involves a lot of reading and is about feelings. So we ditched the booth and we built a blanket fort. In addition, we also got business cards with the URL on it and a little explanation of what the game was about, and stapled Earl Grey tea packets to them with a little note that said, "Go home and play this, don't even try it here, it's not right for it." And sure enough, the fort was completely full the entire time. And it's kind of a nice way to, especially if you're putting yourself out there in such a drastic way, in such a vulnerable way, because that's one of the most terrifying things about making a personal game or something that's something very important to you, is now the entire world knows. For instance, like the first postmortem I ever gave, somebody during the Q&A was like, "Hey, so do you think your future job prospects are affected now that you've come out as having depression?" I'm like, "Oh, I didn't think about that. I gotta go." So it's kind of nice here, if you stay on point and you stay with keeping the subject matter close to your heart, going forward and promoting it, going forward and marketing it, you can keep yourself a little bit sane too, because Lord knows at the end of the day I was hiding in the blanket for it. So if your game is something that's touchy, if it's something that's sensitive, if it's something that's difficult for you to go out and be the face of, I highly recommend making sure that you're not just doing your game justice, but doing yourself justice as well. And I put my slides in the wrong order, so going back to this point. Another part of promotion is how you put the game out there. So since trailers are such a fundamental thing for game promotion and game development, it's like, and it seems to be, again, there's a way of doing things that you see a lot of things do, like following formulaic, show this, then play this music, and do this, and make it this length. If you're making something that's sort of off the beaten path, or something that's about realism, it can be difficult to find the path that's right for you, or a path that works for you at all. So how do you make a trailer for Depression Quest? It's a lot of reading, and nobody wants to read on a video, and that's not very useful. So instead, the trailer for Depression Quest is a 13-second video of me lying in bed staring at the wall with the words Depression Quest coming Valentine's Day 2013 superimposed over it. And in doing this, I think I'm still very happy that it came out the way it did, because it communicated the spirit of the game. It communicated what the point was. It communicated what we were trying to do. It was less so about adding close-in, zoom-ups on text and playing dubstep and be like, whoa, 360 sadness. And more about what the game was. And I feel like effectively putting your game out there is being able to communicate clearly to your audience or to whoever's looking what the game is. And in doing that, I think it did more for it than a traditional trailer would have. Similarly, it was, again, from the taking care of yourself angle, I did this video the day that I lost my job. I did it, I got fired over having pneumonia and needing to go to the hospital because America is fantastic. And I went home, I decided to finish the game and film the trailer the day that I lost my job, and my eyes are still red in it from crying. So if you're really honest and you really put yourself out there, you can create really powerful, really effective things. Yeah, if it's something about personal experience like Depression Quest, trusting yourself and tempering that trust with other people's experience and your research is one of the best things you can do for making something like this. So I guess in summary, to wrap everything up, pretty much everything is a system, and you can take almost anything and turn it into a system. Whether or not it makes for a good game is a whole separate question. You have to examine it from a point of, is the player going to understand what I'm getting? Am I saying what I want to say? Is there a way to say what I want to say? And how do I make all of the design decisions that deliver on whatever the central point is? And the thing that's nice about systems is, there's so many different places you can draw on here. I mean, society in and of itself is a construction of systems. So if you need some inspiration for your next game, maybe consider looking at something that has impacted your life in a very strong and meaningful way that you would like to emulate and get out there. It's not a bad starting point for a game, so much so as anything is a good starting point for a game. Be very mindful of what you're saying, be very mindful of what you're not saying. Run it by as many people as you can. It's sort of weird doing narrative debugging, but it's important. If you can get experts in whatever you're trying to communicate to work with you, I would say definitely do it. Even if it's something that is not necessarily your 100% field of expertise, like Gone Home was written by a man and it's a love story about two queer girls. And it still is completely believable. As a queer white girl grown up, reading it was like reading through Passme's diary. So as long as you're mindful, respectful of what you're trying to say, respectful of your players, making sure that you're not giving people what they think is going to be the definitive story of whatever you're saying, then you're pretty much good to go. So then just make all your choices in every other aspect of the game to refer to whatever that one sentence core conceit is, and then you have a game which is a series of different systems on a micro level all working through to tell the same point. And yeah, that's how I believe we do realism games.
pencil early on. If you need paper and pencil to write a question, please raise your hand. We'll get those brought to you. If you want to tweet us your question, I see the phones hopping out right now. The hashtag is SiegeCon, just SiegeCon, and it is I before E in SiegeCon, so SIEGECON. And while we gather the questions, when you have your question written, please raise your hand and we'll come collect it from you. And go ahead and send it in, and as the tweets come in, we'll start sharing those. So we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation about systems in games as we start collecting the questions and gathering the tweets. So a lot of things I really enjoyed in the presentation, a lot of good stuff. One of the most fascinating aspects of it is that stage when you're done brainstorming what's going into your algorithm, what's going into your system, and throwing out and actually consolidating it down to what are your criteria for what you keep and what you don't. And I love the idea of the core concept, going back to that repeatedly. And I think we can break down those steps a little more. Here's some other things that take into account when you're figuring out what you keep and what don't you. When we did the game Merchant Prince, there's one of the, basically the heart of it is the economic engine to it. You're traveling the world, trading back and forth. So first we've got to calculate out demand. What's demand in one city for anything? So is that based on distance? Is it based on the item? Is it based on what else they sell there? Is it based on that specific population of the city you're selling into? And the list gets tremendous. Thankfully, 3 games to make it work, but the list gets really tremendous. So how do you start knocking that out? So our first decision was to go with the stuff that we thought the players would find most satisfying. So we want them to travel the world. So distance has to be a core point of it. If you're going to bring relics from Antioch to Venice, that's not a huge route, but if you take them on around to Barcelona and then up around Frankfurt, distance needs to be a part of it. We want players to get more involved in the politics of it. So if the player becomes Pope, they can excommunicate a city, prices go up because you can't buy anything, and then you trade your own stuff in there. So you excommunicate it and make money off of your excommunication. If you start spreading the plague through Europe, you're spreading Black Death through Europe, well that drives up prices because everyone thinks they're going to die. So you can send your ships in there, infect the city, and then send ships in there to sell stuff, and hopefully they won't die along the way. But again, we want players to be able to start making these sort of choices. So the number one for us was what's the player going to find satisfying? And I actually think that's something you do in Depression Quest in another way. What's the player going to find most intriguing?
I guess it's less intriguing and more it's like, what are the most important and most common things that depression sufferers live with? What are the most universal things in our research and as you're talking with people? What are the important things that we want to communicate? And in doing that, it was sort of like, I actually had a list of, I guess I was, in early dev notes, I was referring to them as encounters, where it's like, we want to write a thing about this, because this is a thing that we have to deal with constantly, which is one of the reasons that one of the first encounters is someone you care about calls you up and invites you to a party. And leading with, I think, because it's that old adage of you have very little time to get somebody hooked on a game, leading with that and trying to be like, this is probably the most unifying thing I've talked to across everybody that I've talked to, across the therapists, across the research, is dealing with these social situations where you're already drained, you're already having a bad day for depression, and so many people just lie and say they're not feeling well and don't go. Or they go and they aren't really there. So, and it's also a common enough experience that we thought it was relatable. So it's like min-maxing for relatability and universality, because so much of it was about getting the player on board, getting them to relate, getting them to be able to understand that depression isn't a matter of just feel better, it isn't a matter of bad mood, it isn't like the way mental health has been dealt with in so many forms of media. It's just aberrant, like the, oh, crazy people are murdering everybody. So making it very realistic and relatable right out the gate was super important. So prioritizing what do we really want to get across, what do we think the strongest content is, what do we think the content, especially when you've written it and you're deciding what to cut, like going back and being like, this encounter isn't so great. So, because really your experience will be as good as the weakest part of it. So getting rid of anything you're not sure of, I think, is a really good way to do too.
And I think that flows into another important one, is what can your game actually demonstrate well? There are lots of criteria you can come up with and you say, oh, that's not going to be really interesting to implement, or that's going to be a real pain to implement. We certainly came up with tons of things that, no one's going to care about that. I assume you had a lot of the same experiences.
Yeah. And part of it too is just like, what is the scope of the game? Not just from what the scope of what you're capable of producing, but it's also like, how much do you want to ask of your player? Because part of Depression Quest going forward was we were shooting for a target time of about an hour to play. Because it's like, asking the player to do anything more is like, yeah, have a lot of really strong emotions and don't finish this. So it's like, we can't really ask that the player continue to go through all of the stuff that we wish we could communicate. We can't, again, we can't scope it out so that it's a definitive experience or even definitive of the 3 people working on it. So then it's like, okay, what do we think what do we think comes across the best medium in the medium? Like one of the encounters I got added late was one that I wrote when I was having a particularly down period where all of the options are crossed off except the last one no matter what, and through the options, you're basically up and you can't sleep and your brain is going crazy, so the first option's like, just go back to sleep, it'll be fine, and it's crossed off. Second one's like, no, seriously, just lay down and close your eyes and sleep will eventually come. And then it's crossed off. It's like, well, maybe if I put on background noise, like if I put on Netflix in the background, I can finally sleep, and that's crossed off. And then it's like, what is wrong with me? Why can't I sleep? I can't deal with that, and that's crossed off. And then it's like, maybe, like you start thinking, I don't remember if I left this option in or not, but it was one where you only can focus on how fast your heart is beating, and you start wondering, oh my god, is there something wrong with my heart? Oh my god, can I make something be wrong with my heart? Am I thinking about it too much? And that's crossed off. And the final option is just like, just get up and go to your freaking computer, you're not sleeping. And that is something where it's like, we're leaving that in and putting that in because it comes across very well on the core conceit of the game. Whereas like some other stuff that's like kind of more nebulous and difficult to communicate, or something that we've already touched on, that stuff got cut.
Yeah. And it's always pretty interesting because sometimes the algorithms you're designing themselves will tell you what will fit. If there's one variable you really want to put in, but there's no way to make it work with everything else you're doing, that one finally has to go. And those are the ones I hate to cut the most, are the ones I cling to the bitter end, but finally give up. And I think this ties into a good segue into the whole idea of the different systems you put into a game. Few games are one system, and while Depression Quest seems like it's all about depression, there are a number of different systems that are replicated. We did a game like Mall Tycoon, they were kind of more obvious. You have to attract the customers to your mall first, so you have a whole customer attraction rating. Will anyone come to the mall? Once they're there, you have a customer satisfaction rating that changes based on what's in your mall, what they experience in the mall. And that is affected by their hunger. That's affected, and also affected by how badly they have to go to the bathroom and where you place the bathroom. It's great having a bathroom algorithm in a game for deciding how things go. And your game builds on this as well. They're definitely, they feel like they're different systems, like replicating one area.
Yeah, I kind of wish we had a bathroom algorithm now. But yeah, there's a core, I guess, depression level where you're currently at in the game. There's also, the medication factor, whether or not you're taking medication, and sometimes if you are, like some other things will happen later. There's also partner hit points, at least that's what it's called in the back end. So basically I coded it in so that your significant other is like a massive part in the game. And how well you're able to deal with your depression, and whether or not you reach out to her, and how you deal with, how you try and balance this relationship while trying to take care of yourself and deal with your own stuff. It's like, there's a bunch of different outcomes. Like sometimes she moves in, sometimes she leaves you, and I think a lot of the game's really strong writing comes from that interaction and that dynamic. There's also whether or not you've tried to reach out to new people, or whether or not you've gone to therapy, and then there's this dumb little meta mechanic I put in. I don't really know if it worked or not, but I still think it's an interesting idea, where you can get a cat if you so choose, because getting a cat actually was really huge for me dealing with my own depression, just not having an empty house all the time. And getting the cat doesn't actually impact your depression level whatsoever, but it does make the encounters that the player goes through feel less bleak. So it's purely there as a thing for the player, and less so for the main character. And I'm not sure if that worked or not. I don't think most people noticed, but it was something that I was trying to play around with, like a weird narrative system.
And the idea of what players notice or not, that's a great one to deal with next. Let's do that and then we'll go into your questions. So one of the issues as game developers have to decide on is how much of this is going to be obvious to the players and how much are we really going to hide. The beauty of the computer games is just how big these algorithms can be and the players never have to deal with it. So when we did, for instance, our Warhammer 40K game, we have to replicate morale. In the tabletop Warhammer 40K, it's a simple D6 roll based on being attacked. It is as simplified a system as you can get. But if we're doing a computer game, we can suddenly throw everything else on top of that. Is artillery landing nearby? How close are allied units? How many enemy units are within a certain range? How many casualties has that side taken? How many casualties have they inflicted? But do we want the players to know all of this? Because if the enemy just suddenly breaks and runs, or your unit breaks and runs, you'd be really upset. Do you want to know what goes into it? We can throw everything in, or we can make it as simple as that 1d6 roll. And players know, I rolled a 1, my guys break, and they don't care about the fact of everything else that went into it. So for you, a lot of that seemed to be undercover, and some of it seemed to be a little more obvious.
Yeah, Depression Quest was pretty important to try and be transparent because the system was kind of the narrative. But for example, the dating simulator I mentioned that I worked on, that I still really want to finish today, was called, it's not OkCupid, it was supposed to be a satirical online dating simulator. So what I was doing originally in the first prototype of it was you could send out these emails and it decided per sentence what variables were chosen and tracked. So you would like choose one sentence and then that would branch into a bunch of different sentences and those would branch out and each sentence had a variable associated with it, whether or not you were being funny, if you were being kind of a jerk, if you were being on point, how coherent everything was, and then you'd hit send. And then you'd get a message back that was determined by that. What players sat down and saw was, this is a lot of words and I have no idea what's going on. So it completely failed on that notion, which it was kind of good to see that failure, which is why testing early and testing often is a great idea. Because then I'm like, okay, I came up with this system that I think is cool as hell, but I know what's going on. So instead, I scrapped that entirely. Instead of sending emails, you sent instant messengers and you got the notification every time it went off. And you could have that sort of real-time feedback and know what the hell you were doing. And knowing what the hell you're doing, I think, is pretty important.
I definitely agree. Knowing what you're doing, the way you actually handle the morale stuff is there had to be a trigger to make a unit run. So while things could be building up on their morale in the background, if there was an obvious trigger, then nothing should happen. So again, making sure players know that there's something they could have impacted that made a difference. All right, let's go ahead and get the first question. Matt, you want to...
First question. What are the pitfalls of augmentation in the realism with I'm sorry, this might have been written in shorthand. What are the pitfalls of augmenting the realism with hyperbolic, non-realistic situations in order to more accurately share some realistic concept?
Okay. I'm a big fan of that.
I think and I correct me if I'm wrong here, so I think what's being asked is how much do you stand to gain or lose by making something a little bit more cartoonish to prove a point than not
Go over the top.
Yeah. It's tricky, and it really depends on your subject matter, because if it's clear that you're being hyperbolic, and if it's clear that you're aware that this is, not supposed to be representative, I think that's one thing, but if it's kind of nebulous, or if it's suddenly one part's hyperbolic, and you're not really sure, it can fall prey to Poe's law kind of there, where it's like, are they being serious? I can't tell if they're being serious. So if you're going to go hyperbolic, honestly, I don't know that hyperbole has much place in realism, unless it's very nuanced. That really seems like a case-by-case subject. But I guess in terms of Depression Quest, where I guess it was sort of hyperbolic that the main character had access to therapy, a job, a significant other, family who cared, what we stood to gain by doing that, even though it wasn't representative of anybody on the team's example, experience, was that we could show them, we could not only take these things away and show how these things are impacted, but it let us fine-tune, by giving them all this, we could show, this is how a relationship is impacted by depression, this is how a family life is impacted by depression. So being hyperbolic in the sense that most people don't have all these things. It allowed us to examine that. However, it's also been one of the chief criticisms of the game is that most people don't have these things. So it's really a fine line to walk. I don't know that I would have done anything differently, but it is always unfortunate where it's like, this didn't quite land as well as I hoped.
Yeah, I'll take the exact opposite side on this discussion in that I think that going over the top and exaggerating to illustrate a point really can get people looking at things in new ways. This was our experience with Vampire and Werewolf to a tremendous degree. We're talking about if you want to handle a subject, handle it sensitively, that's generally the case, but we threw in a lot of topics into those games, and the responses we got were tremendous. We dealt with child abuse constantly in these games. We felt that this was a major issue that people don't address. They certainly don't address it in games. So when we would deal with this topic, it would really hit people really where they lived. And this was something we constantly heard at conventions, be it the Chicago Night Book. There was one book called Rage Across New York where that was a central aspect of the storyline. I know the author's actually in the audience right now. And we would get people at conventions regularly talking about how much this impacted. We're talking about werewolves and child abuse. It's not exactly day-to-day realism, but it helped people deal with this that they otherwise perhaps would not have, and certainly dealt with it more effectively than we might have dealt with it in other stories. And I'll never claim to be the most sensitive person on any of these issues. We tend to just throw them into games because we think it's going to make for a satisfying play experience. But again, we are saying right from the beginning, we're going over the top. We're going into areas that aren't real, despite the fact we did get a lot of letters from people saying, we're vampires, you got it completely wrong, I'm a vampire, you got it completely right. It's nearly 50-50 split. But there really is a way to deal with real-world serious issues and go way over the top and make it work effectively. But with a game like Depression Quest, we are really saying, I'm going to replicate reality as closely as I can in a simple game like this, in a game that's not going to make you delve down as deep into the code as possible.
Yeah, I think it kind of only really works in one direction too. Like, I think there's I love when I see realistic stuff handled in stuff like Vampire and Werewolf and other places that it's like established that the tone is not one of hyper-realism in all things. But I don't think I could like put a vampire in Depression Quest. I mean, I could, but I mean, like, I feel like if it's sort of over the top already, or at least more fictionalized, you have more space to deal with real world stuff in terms of hyperbole and in terms of these things. Then if you go the other way, and like I think Papo and Yo is a really good example of that. Like, you're dealing with these big monsters and stuff like that, and the core conceit of the game is more game-like. Or more traditional game-like stuff, but it is about child abuse, and it handles the subject matter brilliantly. So I think you can do it one way, but not really the other way.
All right, do we have another question to?
Best worst game that took a lunative approach to the story as opposed to I think they're trying to say neurological.
Okay, what approach versus the neurological?
Okay, so which one did the mechanics tell the story well, or I guess best or worst, versus doing it in a narrative way? I feel like, I'm going to preface this by saying I feel like a jerk for saying this, but there was another game about depression that kind of inspired some of the feelings that we did behind making Depression Quest, called Elude, where it's a platformer and you collect singing birds, and it's supposed to be about depression. But for me, I'm like, why are you jumping if you're depressed? Like, why are you climbing upward? That is the opposite of how it feels. And that sort of is really frustrating, even though I highly respect the developers' work. A closed world kind of frustrated me as well, trying to apply these RPG elements to being closeted, and I think part of it was like my first playthrough. It glitched out and didn't realize that it glitched out and made it so that my partner was opposite sex, but everyone was still really mad at us, and it was confusing. However, one of the best ones I think I've seen is this little game called The Marriage, where there's like a pink blob and a blue blob, and
Oh,
the blue,
yeah.
it shrinks
Rocky,
the
right.
closer. Yeah, it's like hyper minimalist, but it's all it is a system. There's like no words, but it does it quite perfectly in terms of what the point it's trying to get across. So I think that's probably the best example I can think of off the top of my head that just handled all of the meaning, all the story, with gameplay mechanics as opposed to slapping a narrative on it.
I didn't think about that. That's a great example. Rob Hummel does great games, and he was executive producer at Sony, and now he runs Linden Lab, but this is his little side project. Great little game. I'll talk on more the mechanics side. I actually think the game that mechanically hides but does a great job of handling systems is Civilization 2. So you want to talk about a game that shows you the grand scope of humanity, but hides the system. I mean, it just flows so smoothly that all these different things happen, and the world blossoms, all of civilization blossoms in front of you over the course of a game. And you're not really expecting it until you're realizing just what an incredible story is being told without the words having to really come across. And I'll use examples of things that do it badly, mechanics side. There's actually a presentation that I've stolen things from in my presentations about bad games for health. And we talk about the catch the falling fruit games, where you're trying to talk about the system of nutrition, this dramatic issue, but the whole idea is you're running around catching falling fruit and not falling pizzas or candy bars or something like that. And that's what I think is a perfect example of how badly you can do those mechanics. And it's not really incredibly good gameplay, it's not innovative, and it's not really speaking to the player in any sense that matters.
You can kind of see that problem across other disciplines where they're like, oh, we're going to make a game about this thing that we do, and then they don't talk to game designers for some reason. They're like, oh, well, this is what a game looks like. Let's just ape that, but like skin it so it's about our thing. And it's like, no, what are you doing? At best, it's like kind of just like tacked on, and at worst, they can end up with their system saying something kind of messed up.
All right, next Twitter question. We good on the Twitter question?
We could just play Jeff Goldblum staring contest.
Is that a Twitter question? All right. Well, I do have one last area I wanted to talk about, because really this is, to me, the core of what makes games so much fun, is putting together these systems in a way that matter to me as a designer, more importantly, matter to the players. So when you're looking at something to systematize, when you're brainstorming, getting early concept on games, you're talking about you want to do dating games, you want to do question questions, things that are meaningful for us as people. I'm obviously going more on war games and big strategy things. I like to stimulate that aspect of our real lives, space combat in our real lives. So what's next? What are the areas that draw you the most because you think you can come up with a good system for them?
I guess it really depends on like how well I think I can execute it. Like Camp's Not Dead is purely like I grew up and cut my teeth on FMV games. Most people had Nintendos and stuff growing up. My first console was a 3DO that my dad got at a garage sale for $25.
I paid too much.
Way too much. But so I mean, the first console game I played was Night Trap. And it's like, and I think that's why I'm weird. I don't really think about it.
That game.
But it also is, it's like the indie rite of passage to make the retro platformer game of your childhood, except my retro game is Night Trap. So part of it's just poking fun at some stuff. Another game that I have half finished that I really ought to finish is called Bisexual Obstacle Course, where it's trying to express the frustrations that people who don't identify as straight or gay experience, because that's still, unfortunately, in all circles, kind of a difficult thing for people to take seriously. So you basically decide to come out and you tell your straight friends, and they're like, are you sure? Are you sure it's not just a phase? Here, solve this puzzle and prove that you're bisexual. So it'll be like a sliding puzzle, except there's a piece missing and you can't actually prove it. And so you have like a bunch of no-win games, and you're like, well, screw this, I'm going to go hang out with gay people, and it's the exact same thing. But framing the game so that it's sort of using traditional game conventions where you feel like you should be going right, but if you just like go off screen, you can go hang out with people who just don't care and will actually talk to you and like a person instead of trying to make you prove it. So part of it's like venting frustrations that I've had as someone who isn't straight. because I've had girlfriends who kept asking me when I was going to turn on them, or if I was really sure, despite dating them. And similarly, straight men who thought that it meant automatic threesomes, or that I would just like shave my head and run off to a Home Depot or something horribly stereotypical like that. So a part of it is, and it comes from a lot of discussions with other people who face the same thing and all have the same frustrations. So it's like, oh, that's a system. It's not just me. It's something that I feel kind of angsty about, and might as well put it in a game instead of just being like, so things like that are really where I'm like, oh, this is a system. I should emulate this. Similarly, someday I'd like to make something Papers, Please-esque about the mental health care system and how it's overburdened and difficult for everybody involved. But I don't want to do that yet because A, I have too many things I need to finish, and B, I don't want to become mental health lady.
All right, so with that, I would like to thank Zoe Quinn for being willing to come down to Atlanta this weekend and join us. Remember, next question is at 7, and of course, party later tonight outside with Tripwire.